When the plane's engines failed over the Tasman Sea, chaos erupted in the cabin. Passengers wept, prayed, and prepared for the worst. The flight attendants were overwhelmed. That's when Frank Morrison stood up from seat 12A. At 78, he moved with the calm authority of someone who'd faced death before. He organized passengers, directed emergency procedures, and kept panic from turning into stampede. What they didn't know was that he'd landed damaged aircraft before, just never as a passenger. Welcome to ANZAC War Stories. Before we begin this incredible story of crisis, leadership, and the moment when a routine flight became anything but routine, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that heroes aren't born in moments of glory, but revealed in moments of crisis, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the person sitting quietly beside you has been through situations you can't imagine. Jetstar flight JQ520 pushed back from Melbourne's Tullamarine Airport at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. A routine domestic flight to Sydney, 90 minutes of easy flying across southeastern Australia. The Boeing 737 carried 180 passengers and 6 crew members, most of them business travelers, tourists, and families heading north for school holidays. Frank Morrison sat in seat 12A, an aisle seat he'd specifically requested for his arthritic knees. At 78, flying had become more uncomfortable over the years, but he made the journey to Sydney every 3 months to visit his daughter Sarah and her kids. Today's trip was special, his youngest grandson's 8th birthday party tomorrow. Frank had dressed simply for the flight, pressed khakis, a button-down shirt, and a light cardigan. His carry-on bag contained the usual items: reading glasses, a thermos of tea, and the birthday present he'd wrapped himself. He didn't look like much to his fellow passengers, just another elderly traveler taking up space, moving slowly, requiring a bit more time to settle into his seat. The woman in 12B, Jessica Chen, was a marketing executive returning from a Melbourne conference. She'd noticed Frank struggling slightly with his overhead luggage and had offered to help, which he'd politely declined. The man in 12C, David Walsh, was busy with his laptop, preparing for a Sydney presentation, barely acknowledging either of his seatmates. Flight attendant Sarah Mitchell had worked for Jetstar for 8 years. Professional and efficient, she conducted the safety demonstration with practiced precision, while most passengers ignored the instructions about oxygen masks, flotation devices, and emergency exits. Frank, however, watched attentively, his eyes tracking every gesture, every explanation. The first hour passed uneventfully. Frank read his newspaper while Jessica worked on her phone, and David typed furiously on his laptop. The captain announced they were cruising at 37,000 feet with clear weather ahead and an on-time arrival expected in Sydney. Then, at 3:22 p.m., everything changed. The first engine failed without warning. A loud bang echoed through the aircraft, followed by violent shuddering that threw passengers against their seatbelts. Overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage into the aisles. The cabin lights flickered, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow flowers blooming in panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties," Captain Jennifer Hayes announced over the intercom, her voice strained but professional. "Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." But calm was the last thing on anyone's mind. Passengers screamed, children cried, and the acrid smell of electrical burning filled the cabin. The plane lurched to the left as the captain struggled to maintain control with asymmetric thrust. 2 minutes later, the second engine began to fail. The aircraft shuddered more violently now, losing altitude despite the pilot's best efforts. Emergency lighting bathed the cabin in an eerie red glow. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, trying to maintain order, but their own fear was beginning to show. "We're going to die," Jessica whispered, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her oxygen mask. David had closed his laptop and was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. "This can't be happening. This can't be happening." Around them, passengers were in various stages of panic. Some were on their phones trying to make final calls to loved ones. Others sat frozen in terror. A few were praying audibly. The flight attendants were overwhelmed, moving from crisis to crisis as passengers ignored safety instructions in their fear. That's when Frank Morrison unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. At 78, he moved through the lurching aircraft with surprising steadiness, one hand on the seatbacks for balance, the other helping passengers as he made his way forward. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the chaos with quiet authority. "Folks, I need everyone to listen to me," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "We're going to get through this, but I need you to follow instructions exactly." A passenger near the front looked up at him incredulously. "Who are you?" "Sit down, old man." Frank ignored the comment and continued moving forward. He reached the nearest flight attendant, Sarah Mitchell, who was struggling to help an elderly woman with her oxygen mask while other passengers clamored for attention. "Sarah," Frank said, reading her name tag, "I'm Frank Morrison. I have some aviation experience. How can I help?" Sarah looked at him skeptically. Aviation experience? He was just an elderly passenger. But something in his demeanor, the calmness, the way he'd moved through the cabin without panic, made her pause. "The passengers won't listen," she said desperately. "They're not following safety procedures, and we've lost communication with the cockpit." Frank nodded. "Right. First, we need to establish order." "May I?" Without waiting for permission, Frank raised his voice, projecting it throughout the cabin with military precision. "Listen up, everyone. My name is Frank Morrison, and I'm going to help get us home safely. But I need absolute cooperation. If you can hear my voice, raise your hand." Something about his tone, not shouting, not panicked, but carrying absolute authority, made passengers look up. Hands began to raise throughout the cabin. "Good. Now, first things first. If your oxygen mask isn't properly fitted, fix it now. The elastic goes around your head, mask covers nose and mouth completely. Help children and elderly passengers first, then yourselves." Frank moved through the cabin systematically, checking masks, helping passengers, speaking calmly to those who were panicking. Jessica in 12B watched in amazement as the chaotic cabin began to organize itself around this elderly man's quiet commands. "Sir," she called out as he passed, "are you a pilot?" Frank paused for just a moment. "I was." "Long time ago." He continued forward, reaching the area near the cockpit where the senior flight attendant, Mark Stevens, was trying to coordinate the crew's response. Mark looked frazzled, clearly overwhelmed by the emergency. "Mark," Frank said, again reading the name tag. "What's the situation with the flight deck?" "Who's asking?" Mark replied, stress making his voice sharp. "Frank Morrison, former RAAF. What's your communication status with the pilots?" The letters RAAF, Royal Australian Air Force, made Mark look at Frank more carefully. They're struggling up there. Lost both engines trying to restart. Haven't had much time to communicate," Frank nodded. "I need to speak with them." "Can you get me intercom access?" Mark hesitated. This was completely against protocol. Passengers didn't communicate with the flight deck during emergencies. But nothing about this situation was normal, and the elderly man's calm competence was the only thing that seemed to be working. I'm not supposed to." "Mark," Frank said quietly, "I've landed aircraft with engine failures before. In Vietnam, in situations where not landing meant not going home. Trust me on this." Something in Frank's eyes, the absolute certainty, the weight of experience, convinced Mark. He handed Frank the intercom handset. "Captain Hayes, this is Frank Morrison in the cabin. I'm former RAAF, Vietnam era. I have some experience with emergency procedures if you need assistance." There was a pause. Then Captain Hayes's voice, strained but professional. "Mr. Morrison, we've lost both engines. Attempting restart procedures, but we're losing altitude rapidly. Any suggestions would be appreciated. Frank's military training took over completely. What's your current altitude and rate of descent?" 28,000 feet, descending at 1,200 feet per minute." Frank closed his eyes, calculating quickly. "Wind conditions?" "Tailwind, 15 knots." "Right. You've got about 20 minutes before you need to commit to a water landing. Have you attempted the windmill restart procedure?" "Negative. We've been focusing on standard restart protocols." "Try the windmill restart on engine 2 first. If you can get partial power, you can stretch your glide. And consider dumping fuel now while you have altitude. You'll need the weight reduction for either a water landing or emergency field approach." In the cockpit, Captain Hayes looked at her co-pilot, James Reed, a young officer with less than 2 years' experience. They'd been trained for engine failures, but losing both engines over water was every pilot's nightmare. The calm voice from the cabin offering specific technical advice was exactly what they needed. "Beginning windmill restart on engine 2, Captain Hayes announced. Back in the cabin, Frank had transformed from passenger to emergency coordinator. He moved through the aircraft methodically, organizing passengers into groups, identifying those with medical training, ensuring that emergency positions were properly demonstrated. "You," he said to David Walsh, who was still gripping his armrests. "What do you do for work?" I'm an accountant," David stammered. "Good. You're organized, detail-oriented. I need you to help count passengers in your section and make sure everyone understands the brace position. Can you do that?" David nodded, grateful to have something concrete to focus on rather than his fear. Frank found Jessica Chen, who had been watching his every move. "You said you're in marketing. That means you're good with people, right?" "Yes, but I don't understand." "I need you to work with the flight attendants to identify passengers with medical training. If we have a rough landing, we'll need to organize triage quickly." As Frank organized the cabin, something remarkable happened. The panic subsided. Passengers began helping each other, following instructions, preparing for whatever came next. Children stopped crying as adults around them projected calm instead of fear. The chaos transformed into controlled preparation. From the cockpit came Captain Hayes' voice. "Mr. Morrison, Engine 2 is showing signs of response. Partial power restored." A cheer went up from some passengers, but Frank's voice cut through it immediately. "Stay focused, everyone. We're not home yet." He was right. Partial power from one engine wasn't enough to maintain altitude, but it could extend their range significantly. The question now was whether they could reach an emergency landing field or would have to attempt a water landing in the Tasman Sea. Frank returned to the intercom. "Captain, what's your current position and available airfields?" "We're about 200 kilometers northeast of Lord Howe Island. Closest mainland field is Coffs Harbour, but we don't have the altitude to reach it," Frank calculated quickly. Lord Howe Island had a small airfield, but it was challenging even under normal conditions. Short runway, surrounded by ocean, tricky winds. With partial engine power and an aircraft full of passengers, it would be extremely difficult. "What about Norfolk Island?" Frank asked. There was a pause. "Norfolk Island? Yes, that's possible. Longer runway, better approach, but it's still marginal with our current descent rate." "Captain, I recommend Norfolk Island. Vector for runway 11. Begin descent now to conserve what altitude you have for the approach." Over the next 30 minutes, Frank Morrison transformed Flight JQ520 from a panic-stricken disaster into an organized emergency response. He moved through the cabin continuously, checking on passengers, ensuring procedures were followed, maintaining the calm that kept 180 people from losing hope. When Captain Hayes announced that they were beginning their approach to Norfolk Island Airport, Frank gathered the passengers' attention one final time. "Folks, we're about to attempt an emergency landing. This is going to be rough, but the pilots know what they're doing and we're prepared. When I give the signal, assume brace position and hold it until we come to a complete stop. No one moves until the crew gives the all clear." "Clear?" A chorus of "yes" filled the cabin. These weren't panicked passengers anymore. They were a coordinated team, led by an elderly man who'd somehow convinced them all that survival was possible. The landing was indeed rough. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced twice, then settled onto the runway with maximum braking. Emergency vehicles raced alongside as the plane finally came to a stop, 400 meters from the end of the runway. But they were down. They were safe. All 180 passengers and 6 crew members survived without serious injury. As passengers began to evacuate via emergency slides, Captain Hayes made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that our safe landing today was possible because of the extraordinary assistance provided by passenger Frank Morrison in seat 12A. Mr. Morrison is a former Royal Australian Air Force pilot who served in Vietnam. His guidance from the cabin helped us navigate procedures that saved everyone on board." The evacuation paused as passengers turned to look at Frank, who was helping elderly passengers toward the exits. Spontaneous applause began, growing until the entire cabin was clapping. Frank raised a hand for quiet. "No applause necessary, folks. We all did our part today. Now let's get off this aircraft and call our families." 3 hours later, after emergency services had processed all passengers and the media had arrived, Frank Morrison sat in the Norfolk Island Airport terminal, quietly drinking tea and waiting for the replacement aircraft that would take them to Sydney. A reporter approached him. "Mr. Morrison, passengers are calling you a hero. How do you respond to that?" Frank looked up from his tea. "Hero? No, love. I'm just an old pilot who remembered his training. The real heroes were Captain Hayes and her crew, who got us down safely, and the passengers who kept their heads when things got scary." Jessica Chen, who had been watching from across the terminal, approached him. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you. When you stood up in that cabin, everything changed. How did you know what to do?" Frank smiled gently. "Vietnam taught me a few things about staying calm under pressure, and about taking care of the people around you when things go wrong." "Were you really a pilot in Vietnam?" "Transport pilot, mostly. Few combat missions. Nothing too dramatic." Frank's understated response was typical. He'd flown over 200 missions, including several under enemy fire, but would never volunteer that information. David Walsh joined them, still looking shaky but grateful. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology. When you first stood up, I thought you were just some old bloke who didn't understand the situation." Frank chuckled. "Son, I've been underestimated before. Doesn't bother me. What matters is whether people listen when it counts. The story of Flight JQ520 became national news within hours. Video from passengers' phones showed Frank moving calmly through the chaotic cabin, organizing the emergency response while others panicked. Aviation experts praised his technical knowledge and crisis management. The Transport Safety Bureau called his intervention instrumental in preventing potential casualties. But Frank Morrison was already gone by the time the major news crews arrived. He'd caught the first replacement flight to Sydney, where his daughter Sarah and grandson were waiting at the airport, having heard about the emergency landing on the news. "Dad," Sarah said, hugging him tightly, "I was so scared when I heard about the plane." Frank held her close. "All fine, sweetheart. Just a bit of turbulence. Nothing I hadn't seen before." 8-year-old Tommy looked up at his grandfather with new eyes. "Grandpa, they said on TV that you saved everyone on the plane." Frank knelt down to Tommy's level. "No, mate. Everyone saved everyone. That's how it works when people help each other." The following week, Frank Morrison received a letter from Jetstar's CEO, thanking him for his assistance and offering him free flights for life. He politely declined the offer, saying he was happy to pay his own way. Captain Jennifer Hayes wrote him a personal note. "Mr. Morrison, your calm guidance from the cabin gave us the confidence to attempt procedures we might have hesitated to try. You didn't just help save lives, you reminded us what leadership looks like under pressure." Frank kept the note in his kitchen drawer, next to Margaret's photograph and the ANZAC medal from the antique shop. Quiet reminders of a life spent serving others, whether in war or peace, whether in uniform or civilian clothes. 3 months later, Frank made his regular flight to Sydney for another family visit. He requested seat 12A again, packed his usual carry-on bag, and settled in for what he hoped would be a routine journey. The flight attendant recognized him immediately. "Mr. Morrison, we're honored to have you flying with us today. Is there anything special we can do for your flight?" Frank smiled and shook his head. "Just get us there safely, love. That's all any of us really want." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Frank opened his newspaper and settled in for the flight. Around him, other passengers went about their routines, unaware that the quiet elderly man in 12A had once again demonstrated that heroism isn't about recognition or glory. It's about knowing what to do when others don't, and having the courage to do it. So tell us, have you ever been in a crisis where someone unexpected stepped up to lead? Someone whose background you never would have guessed, who took charge when others couldn't. Someone whose calm presence changed everything. Share their story in the comments. Tell us how they handled the pressure and what you learned from watching them work. Because here at ANZAC War Stories, we believe that real leadership isn't about titles or positions. It's about stepping up when people need you most. Subscribe to make sure these stories of quiet courage and unexpected leadership continue to be told. And remember, sometimes the person sitting quietly beside you has been through situations you can't imagine, and when the moment comes, they'll know exactly what to do. Lest we forget,